Look, I'm not saying the Galactic Council meeting was a complete disaster, but when you have 17 different species arguing about protective equipment regulations, and one of them literally molts from stress, you know you're in for a long day. And I do mean long. Apparently, when you factor in different planetary rotations and the fact that the Zeltharians experience time in reverse on Tuesdays, a brief discussion can last anywhere from 3 hours to next Thursday. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up and explain how humanity accidentally became the universe's most reluctant safety inspectors. It started, as most interstellar incidents do, with a workplace accident. Specifically, a workplace accident involving senior engineer David Park and what the manufacturer had optimistically labeled as military-grade exoskeleton armor, Mark 7, now with 47% less explosive decompression. The 47% less part should have been our first clue. David was 3 weeks into his assignment aboard the hegemony research station Infinite Wisdom, which, judging by recent events, was either deeply ironic or flat-out false advertising when the accident happened. The station was studying some kind of exotic matter that the Corvinathi had discovered, something they claimed could revolutionize faster-than-light travel, terraform planets, and probably make a decent sandwich spread if you added the right spices. The Corvinathi, bless their crystalline hearts, are about as cautious as a caffeinated squirrel in a fireworks factory. Their idea of safety protocols involves saying a prayer to their geometric gods and hoping the explosion doesn't violate any fundamental laws of physics. Most of them, anyway. So naturally, they'd built their entire research apparatus out of materials that, while technically exotic matter resistant, had roughly the same structural integrity as wet cardboard when exposed to anything resembling actual stress. The humans on the station had been politely suggesting improvements for months, but you know how it is with interspecies diplomacy. Sometimes constructive criticism gets lost in translation and comes out as, "Your technology is garbage and we're amazed you haven't accidentally destroyed your homeworld yet." Which, to be fair, was pretty accurate. David was running routine maintenance on one of the containment fields when things went sideways. According to the incident report, and I use the term incident the way meteorologists use partly cloudy to describe hurricanes, a minor fluctuation in the exotic matter caused a cascade failure in the station's power grid, which triggered an emergency lockdown, which activated the fire suppression system, which somehow managed to electrify all the safety equipment. The other species on the station were, naturally, completely screwed. The Corvinathi couldn't move in their bulky crystalline environment suits. The Vaxi were trapped in their sealed atmospheric chambers. The Relthan were locked inside their mobile life support units, beeping pathetically like oversized smoke detectors. And David? David just sighed, rolled up his sleeves, and got to work. Now, I should mention that David wasn't exactly what you'd call a typical human specimen. He was maybe 5'8" on a good day, had the kind of pale complexion that suggested his natural habitat involved fluorescent lighting and energy drinks, and wore glasses thick enough to start fires. Not exactly the image of human physical supremacy that our propaganda department likes to project. But here's the thing about humans that the rest of the galaxy keeps forgetting. We're incredibly bad at dying when it's inconvenient. See, while the Corvinathi were developing crystal-based technology and the Vaxi were perfecting atmospheric controls and the Relthan were engineering life support systems that could sustain them in virtually any environment, humans were busy being the universe's scrappiest survivors. We spent a couple 100,000 years on a planet that was actively trying to kill us. Ice ages, volcanoes, predators with more teeth than a saw blade convention, weather patterns that changed faster than a teenager's mood, and diseases that treated our immune system like a speed bump. Our response to all this was not to build better armor or develop superior technology. Our response was to become unkillable. Well, technically killable, but really inconveniently killable. David walked through that electrified, irradiated, structurally compromised station like he was strolling through a park. When the artificial gravity failed, he just pushed off the walls and kept moving. When the atmospheric processors shut down and the air started getting thin, he held his breath and worked faster. When the radiation detectors started screaming warnings that would have sent any sensible species running for the nearest bunker, he just muttered something about how this was still not as bad as that time in Nevada, and kept troubleshooting. The station's AI, a Corvinathi design that was probably very impressive when it wasn't having a complete nervous breakdown, kept broadcasting increasingly frantic warnings about environmental hazards, structural collapse, and imminent death. David's response was to put his hand over the speaker and tell it to, "Keep it down, I'm trying to concentrate." It took him 4 hours to get the power back online, restore life support, and stabilize the exotic matter containment. 4 hours of working in conditions that should have killed him 17 different ways. When the emergency lockdown finally lifted and the rescue teams arrived, they found David sitting in the station's control room, calmly filling out maintenance reports and eating a sandwich he'd apparently made during one of the brief periods when the food synthesizers came back online. The Korvanathi medical team rushed him through every scanner they had, convinced he must be dying of radiation poisoning or exotic matter exposure, or at least suffering from some kind of severe atmospheric contamination. The results showed he was perfectly healthy, though possibly suffering from mild dehydration, and what their computers helpfully identified as insufficient caffeine intake. That's when the questions started. "How?" asked Dr. Zara Cavell, the station's chief Korvanathi physician. "Did you survive 4 hours of direct exposure to exotic matter radiation?" David shrugged. "I don't know. How do you survive being made of rocks? My physiology is specifically adapted to... That's not the same thing at all."
"You're made of soft organic matter. You should be dead."
"Yeah, I get that a lot." The incident report made its way up the hegemony command structure, where it joined approximately 400 other incident reports involving humans doing things that were, by all reasonable standards, impossible. Like the time Engineer Williams had manually realigned a fusion reactor while it was still running. Or when Technician Brooks had gone EVA to repair hull breaches without a suit because the station's environmental systems were down, and he didn't want to wait around for someone to find him a spacesuit that fit. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Humans had a disturbing tendency to survive things that killed everything else, and they did it with the kind of casual indifference usually reserved for bad weather or traffic jams. The Galactic Council, being a bureaucratic organization with the collective imagination of a particularly dim houseplant, decided the obvious solution was to mandate better safety equipment. If humans were surviving these situations, it was clearly because they had superior protective gear that they weren't sharing with their galactic neighbors. It was the only logical explanation. Which brings us back to that council meeting, where I had the distinct pleasure of watching 17 different species argue about humanity's secret armor technology, while the lone human representative, a woman named Captain Elena Vasquez, sat quietly in the corner, looking like she was trying very hard not to laugh. "The human delegation," announced Counselor Zefton in their most official voice, "will now explain the nature of their advanced protective equipment so that appropriate safety standards can be established for all hegemony personnel." Captain Vasquez looked around the room with the expression of someone who had just been asked to explain why water is wet. "I'm sorry, what protective equipment?" "The armor," insisted Counselor Brex 9 Clicks, their carapace rattling with indignation. "The advanced defensive systems that allow your species to survive in conditions lethal to all other known lifeforms." "We don't have armor." The silence that followed was the kind of complete, profound silence usually reserved for funerals, library reading rooms, and that moment when you realize you've been talking to your boss's voicemail for the past 3 minutes. "That's impossible," said Counselor Thijs Cavell. "Our scans of the incident aboard Infinite Wisdom clearly show..." "Show what? David Park walking around in jeans and a t-shirt?" "There must be some form of integrated protection." "Nanotechnology."
"Genetic modification. Energy shielding."
Captain Vasquez leaned back in her chair. "Nope, just stubbornness and spite, mostly." And that's when she started laughing. It wasn't malicious laughter, or condescending laughter, or any of the types of laughter that usually accompany interspecies diplomatic incidents. It was the kind of laughter that comes from finally understanding a joke that everyone else has been missing. "You want to know why humans don't need armor?" she said, rolling up her sleeves. "Because we are the armor." "That makes no sense," protested Counselor Zefton. "Doesn't it? Look, let me ask you something. What's the most dangerous thing on your homeworld?" "The crystalline storms that can shatter mountains," replied Counselor Thijs Cavell proudly. "Solar radiation bursts," said Counselor Brex 9 Clicks. "Temporal anomalies," offered Counselor Vex Prime. Captain Vasquez nodded. "Right. So you developed technology to protect you from those specific threats. Your evolution was shaped by your environment, and your technology was shaped by your evolution." "Makes perfect sense." "Exactly. Which is why we don't understand how your species, Earth," Captain Vasquez interrupted, "tried to kill us with everything. All of it. At once. For millions of years." She stood up and began pacing, warming to her subject. Ice ages that lasted hundreds of thousands of years. Volcanic eruptions that blocked out the sun. Earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, droughts, blizzards, heat waves. Predators that could outrun us, outclimb us, outswim us, and had better teeth, claws, and senses than we did. Diseases that jumped between species like they were playing hopscotch. Plants that were poisonous. Water that was contaminated. Air that was sometimes just straight up toxic. The council members were leaning forward now, their various appendages and sensory organs focused intently on her words. And our response wasn't to build better shelters or develop advanced technology. Our response was to become the kind of organism that could survive all of that. We became generalists, adaptable, redundant, stubborn. But that's impossible, insisted Counselor Brex 9 Clicks. No single species can adapt to such a wide range of threats. Can't they? Captain Vasquez smiled. David Park survived 4 hours of exotic matter radiation. You know why? Because humans have been surviving radiation exposure for millennia. Solar radiation, cosmic radiation, radiation from natural radioactive materials. We developed cellular repair mechanisms that just handle it. But the atmospheric contamination, humans can hold their breath for several minutes, function on reduced oxygen, and process a wide range of atmospheric compositions. We evolved at different altitudes, in different climates, with different air qualities. Our respiratory and circulatory systems are incredibly adaptive. The structural damage to the station. Humans have excellent spatial reasoning, problem-solving abilities, and fine motor control. We can work with tools in low-light conditions, unstable environments, and while under physical stress. We've been doing it for tens of thousands of years. Counselor Vex Prime's translator unit crackled. This is describing biological armor. Exactly! Captain Vasquez clapped her hands together. You built technological solutions to protect you from your specific environmental threats. We became the solution. We are walking, talking biological hazmat suits designed by millions of years of everything trying to kill us. But surely there are limits? Of course there are limits. David Park was lucky. Put him in vacuum, he dies. Expose him to enough radiation, he dies. Subject him to extremes of temperature or pressure or chemical exposure, he dies. But the point is, his operating parameters are ridiculously wide compared to most species. And more importantly, she paused for dramatic effect, he doesn't panic. What do you mean? Asked Counselor Thais Cavell. When your crystalline storms hit, what's your species' response? We take shelter. We activate our protective systems. We wait for it to pass. Right. When our planet tried to kill us, we couldn't take shelter. We didn't have protective systems. We couldn't wait for it to pass because it never passed. So we learned to keep working, keep thinking, keep problem-solving even when everything around us was actively trying to kill us. Captain Vasquez walked over to the chamber's environmental controls and began adjusting settings. The room's temperature started climbing. David Park didn't survive that station because he had superior technology. He survived because when everything went wrong, his response was to assess the situation, prioritize tasks, and get to work. While everyone else was waiting for rescue or for systems to come back online, he was fixing the problem. The room was getting uncomfortably warm now. Several council members were activating personal cooling systems. Humans don't have the luxury of waiting for ideal conditions. She continued, raising her voice slightly as the atmospheric processors began cycling louder to compensate for the temperature change. We learned a long time ago that ideal conditions are a myth, so we learned to operate under whatever conditions we've got. She cranked the temperature up another 10 degrees. This is becoming uncomfortable, protested Counselor Brex 9 Clicks. Is it? Captain Vasquez was still speaking in a normal tone, showing no signs of discomfort. This is about 85 degrees. That's a warm summer day on Earth. I once spent 3 weeks working in 120-degree heat-fixing atmospheric processors on a desert planet. My great-grandfather used to work construction in this kind of temperature while wearing heavy equipment and doing manual labor. She adjusted the controls again, bringing the temperature back down but increasing the humidity. The point is, she said as several council members activated additional environmental systems, humans aren't better than you. We're not stronger or smarter or more advanced. We're just stubborn and adaptable. And we have a really, really high tolerance for things being terrible. But there must be some technology. There is. Captain Vasquez smiled. It's called evolutionary pressure, and the technology is 4 billion years old. Counselor Zefton was quiet for a long moment. Are you saying that humans are naturally adapted to survive in hostile environments? I'm saying humans are naturally adapted to work in hostile environments. Survival is just the first step. The important part is that we keep functioning, keep thinking, keep solving problems even when everything is going wrong. This is... Counselor Vex Prime's translator unit stuttered. This is a completely different approach to environmental adaptation than any known species has developed. Yeah, well, Earth was a completely different kind of environment than most planets. Most worlds have one or two major threats that shape how their life evolves. Earth had all of them at once, for a really long time. Captain Vasquez sat back down and rolled her sleeves back down.
Look, I'm not saying humans are invincible.
We're not. We just have a really wide operational envelope, and we don't panic when things go outside normal parameters. That's not superior technology, it's just a different evolutionary strategy.
But the safety regulations, began Counselor Brex 9 Clicks, are absolutely necessary, Captain Vasquez agreed.
Just because humans can survive in conditions that would kill other species doesn't mean we should have to. And just because we can work through emergencies doesn't mean we shouldn't try to prevent emergencies in the first place. She gestured around the chamber. This whole discussion started because a research station had inadequate safety systems and poor emergency protocols. David Park shouldn't have had to work in those conditions, regardless of whether he could survive them. The solution isn't better armor for humans. The solution is better engineering, better safety systems, and better emergency procedures for everyone.
So you're saying humans don't need special protective equipment? Asked Counselor Thijs Cavell.
I'm saying humans need the same protective equipment everyone else needs. We just happen to have better backup systems when the protective equipment fails. The room was quiet again, but this time it was the thoughtful kind of silence that comes when everyone is trying to process new information, rather than the horrified kind that comes when someone accidentally admits to interstellar law violations. Finally, Counselor Zefton spoke up. Perhaps we have been approaching this issue from the wrong angle. How so? We have been assuming that the solution to safety hazards is better personal protective equipment. But if humans can serve as biological protective equipment, perhaps the solution is to have human personnel present during high-risk operations. Captain Vasquez blinked. You want to use humans as living safety systems? Not exactly. But perhaps human personnel could serve as emergency response specialists. Personnel who can continue to function and solve problems when normal safety systems fail. That's... Captain Vasquez paused, clearly trying to think through the implications. That's actually not a terrible idea. Humans do tend to excel at emergency response and crisis management. It would require specialized training, noted Counselor Vex Prime. And appropriate compensation, added Counselor Brex 9 Clicks. And very clear protocols about when and how such personnel would be deployed, insisted Counselor Thijs Cavell. Captain Vasquez was quiet for a moment, then smiled. You know what? This might actually work. Instead of trying to make everyone else as survivable as humans, we use humans as specialized emergency response personnel for situations that would overwhelm normal safety systems. A human emergency response corps, mused Counselor Zefton. Crisis management specialists, suggested Counselor Vex Prime. Disaster response engineers, offered Counselor Brex 9 Clicks.
I like that last one, said Captain Vasquez.
Disaster response engineers. Humans who are specifically trained and equipped to handle emergencies that are too dangerous or complex for normal response protocols. It would solve the safety regulation problem, noted Counselor Thijs Cavell. Instead of trying to mandate protective equipment that may not exist, we mandate the presence of personnel who can function without such equipment. And it plays to human strengths, added Captain Vasquez. We're good at improvisation, problem-solving under pressure, and working in hostile environments. This would just be formalizing something we already do. The council members began discussing logistics, training requirements, deployment protocols, and bureaucratic procedures with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for budget meetings and tax legislation. Captain Vasquez sat back and watched them plan the future of interstellar emergency response, occasionally nodding or offering suggestions. It wasn't until later, after the meeting had ended and the various council members had dispersed to their respective ships and stations, that Counselor Thijs Cavell approached Captain Vasquez privately. I have a question about something you said earlier, the Corvinathi said. What's that? You mentioned that humans learn to function in hostile environments because Earth tried to kill you with everything. But surely that's an exaggeration. Captain Vasquez pulled out a small data pad and called up what appeared to be a planetary survey report. Hurricanes with winds over 200 miles per hour. Tornadoes that can level entire cities. Earthquakes that can reshape continents. Volcanoes that can alter global climate. Floods that can submerge entire regions. Droughts that can last for decades. Temperatures ranging from -80 to +130 degrees Fahrenheit. Atmospheric pressure that varies by altitude. Radiation exposure from solar activity. Predators including creatures with neurotoxic venom, crushing bite forces exceeding 12,000 pounds per square inch, and pack hunting strategies. Diseases including everything from hemorrhagic fevers to flesh-eating bacteria to viruses that attack the nervous system. She handed the datapad to Counselor Thijs Cavell, who examined it with growing alarm. And that's just the natural hazards, Captain Vasquez continued. That doesn't include the things humans did to each other, or the environmental damage we caused, or the new threats we created through industrialization and technology development.
This is a death world, Counselor Thijs Cavell said quietly.
Yeah, we figured that out pretty early.
What took us longer to figure out was that most planets aren't like that. When we started meeting other species and seeing other worlds, we kept wondering why everyone was so fragile.
We're not fragile, protested Counselor Thijs Cavell.
We're adapted to our environments.
Right, exactly. You're perfectly adapted to your specific environments. You've got elegant, efficient solutions to the particular challenges your worlds present.
Humans, on the other hand, are crudely adapted to surviving everything at once. Captain Vasquez took back the datapad and scrolled through more information.
It's like...
Imagine if you designed a vehicle to travel on crystal planes during crystal storms. You'd make it streamlined, resilient to crystalline impacts, able to navigate by crystal resonance patterns.
It would be perfect for that environment.
Yes, that makes sense. Now imagine if you designed a vehicle that had to work on crystal plains, in volcanic ash fields, underwater, in zero gravity, on ice, in desert sand, through swamps, up mountains, and in the middle of active war zones.
It wouldn't be elegant or efficient.
It would be big, crude, over-engineered, and probably held together with backup systems for the backup systems.
That would be very expensive and impractical.
Exactly. But if something went wrong with your elegant crystal plane vehicle, it would be completely useless. If something went wrong with the over-engineered multi-environment vehicle, it would probably keep working, just not as well. Counselor Thijs Cavell was quiet for a moment. Humans are the over-engineered multi-environment vehicle. We're the over-engineered multi-environment vehicle that evolution built over millions of years because Earth couldn't decide what it wanted to kill us with, so it just tried everything. And now you're offering to share this crude adaptability with the rest of the galaxy. Captain Vasquez shrugged.
Why not? We're already out here anyway. Might as well make ourselves useful.
As it turned out, the Human Disaster Response Corps was a massive success. Within 6 months of the program's launch, human emergency response teams were deployed across 17 different star systems, handling everything from reactor malfunctions to atmospheric collapses to exotic matter containment breaches. The teams were small, usually just 2 or 3 humans with specialized training and basic emergency equipment. But they had an almost supernatural ability to assess crisis situations, identify critical problems, and implement solutions under conditions that would paralyze most emergency response protocols. More importantly, they had a talent for improvisation that other species found both impressive and deeply unsettling. Take the incident on the Vaxi Research Station Harmonious Inquiry. A cascade failure in their atmospheric processing system had created a toxic gas leak that made the station uninhabitable for Vaxi personnel, while simultaneously causing power fluctuations that disabled their automated repair systems. The station's emergency protocols called for complete evacuation and waiting for specialized hazmat teams to arrive from the Vaxi homeworld. A process that would take 6 weeks and cost approximately 4 million credits. The Human Disaster Response Team, 2 engineers named Kim and Brooks, arrived 8 hours after the emergency beacon was activated. Kim took one look at the situation report, walked over to a maintenance panel, and started rewiring the atmospheric processors while wearing nothing more than a standard breathing mask.
This is completely against safety protocols,
protested Station Commander Vex Siltan through the comm system from the evacuated command ship.
Yeah, I know, Kim replied, elbow deep in circuitry that was sparking and occasionally emitting small puffs of toxic gas.
Brooks, can you check the secondary intake valves? The ones that are currently venting poison gas? Those would be the ones.
Sure, no problem.
Brooks walked into a cloud of gas that would have killed most species in minutes, adjusted some valves, and walked back out like he'd just been checking the mail.
How are they doing that?
Asked Commander Vex Siltan. Humans have surprisingly resilient respiratory systems, explained Captain Vasquez over the comm, and a high tolerance for chemical exposure. Plus, they're both wearing breathing masks with basic atmospheric filters.
Basic filters shouldn't be sufficient for that level of contamination.
Shouldn't be, no. But humans have backup detoxification systems that most species don't, and they're working quickly to minimize exposure time. 2 hours later, the atmospheric processors were back online, the toxic gases had been cleared, and the station was habitable again. Total cost: approximately 800 credits in replacement parts, and 2 bottles of whatever human emergency response teams use to wash the taste of toxic gas out of their mouths. The incident report, which made its way through Vaxi bureaucracy and eventually to the Galactic Council, contained a footnote that would become famous throughout the galaxy. Human personnel completed repairs while exposed to atmospheric contaminants at levels 400% above established safety thresholds. When asked about this afterward, Engineer Kim stated that it was not as bad as that one job site in New Jersey and requested permission to bill for hazard pay. Stories like this began circulating throughout the galaxy, and humans quickly developed a reputation as the people you called when everything was going wrong and normal solutions weren't working. There was the time a human response team manually stabilized a failing fusion reactor by climbing inside the reactor housing while it was still running, because the automated systems had been damaged and someone needed to realign the magnetic containment fields by hand. There was the incident where a human engineer restored power to an entire mining station by hot-wiring the electrical systems while standing waist-deep in contaminated coolant that would have dissolved most organic matter. There was the famous case of the human team that prevented a catastrophic atmospheric collapse on a Relthan colony world by spending 36 straight hours rebuilding life support systems while exposed to radiation levels that should have killed them. Each incident report contained the same kinds of matter-of-fact descriptions of humans doing things that were, by any reasonable standard, impossible. And each report ended with some variation of the same conclusion. Mission accomplished, minimal casualties, humans apparently fine despite exposure to conditions that should have been lethal. The galaxy began to take notice. "There's something we need to discuss," Counselor Zeph Ton announced at the next Galactic Council meeting. "The budget allocation for the Human Disaster Response Corps?" asked Captain Vasquez. "Because I have some thoughts about hazard pay rates. The humans themselves." Captain Vasquez raised an eyebrow. "What about us?" "We've been reviewing the incident reports from the past year. The pattern is concerning." "Concerning how?" Counselor Thys-Cavell activated a holographic display showing statistics from various emergency responses. "In the past 12 months, human response teams have been exposed to lethal levels of radiation 47 times, toxic atmospheric conditions 32 times, extreme temperatures 18 times, and various exotic matter effects 9 times. They have worked in structural collapse situations, aboard ships losing atmospheric integrity, and in environments with gravity fields that should have crushed most organic beings." "Right, that's what they're trained for." "The concerning part," continued Counselor Zeph Ton, "is that they haven't died." "Well, good." "Captain Vasquez," said Counselor Brex 9 clicks. "In the past year, human emergency response personnel have survived conditions that have a 100% fatality rate for every other known species." "Not 100%, Captain Vasquez corrected. "There was that incident on the Corvinathi mining station where Engineer Kim got mild radiation poisoning. She was sick for 3 days. That was from exposure to radiation levels that would have killed a Corvinathi in minutes." "Right, but she did get sick. So it's not like we're invulnerable or anything." The council members exchanged what, in their various species, probably counted as meaningful glances. "Captain Vasquez," said Counselor Vex Prime carefully, "are humans aware that they are significantly more resilient than other galactic species?" "Well, yeah. We've always known that. I mean, Earth was a death world, so we kind of had to be resilient to survive there. But did you know that the degree of resilience is unusual?" Captain Vasquez was quiet for a moment. "Define unusual." Counselor Thys-Cavell pulled up another display, this one showing comparative survival statistics. The average Corvinathi can survive in temperatures ranging from 70 to 90 degrees, with atmospheric pressure between 0.8 and 1.2 standard units, and can tolerate radiation exposure up to 0.3 rems before experiencing cellular damage. Okay. The average Vaxi can survive in temperatures from 65 to 85 degrees, atmospheric pressure between 1.1 and 1.4 standard units, and radiation exposure up to 0.1 rems. Right. The average Relthan can survive temperatures from 75 to 95 degrees, atmospheric pressure between 0.9 and 1.1 standard units, and radiation exposure up to 0.4 rems. Captain Vasquez nodded. "Those all seem like reasonable parameters." "The average human," continued Counselor Thys-Cavell, "can apparently survive in temperatures from -40 to +120 degrees, atmospheric pressure from 0.5 to 2.0 standard units, and radiation exposure up to 50 rems before experiencing serious cellular damage." "That sounds about right." "Captain Vasquez, that means humans can survive in environmental conditions that are 10 to 20 times more extreme than what other species can tolerate." "Huh. I mean, I knew we were tougher than most species, but I didn't realize it was that much of a difference." "It's not just toughness," said Counselor Zeph Ton. "It's adaptability. Other species have narrow optimal parameters and quickly lose functionality outside those parameters. Humans seem to maintain operational capacity across an incredibly wide range of conditions. Right, well, like I said before, Earth was really unpredictable. We had to be adaptable. But this level of adaptability is unprecedented, insisted Counselor Brex 9clicks. No known species has developed this kind of environmental flexibility. Captain Vasquez shrugged. Maybe other planets were just more consistent than Earth. Captain, said Counselor Vex Prime, we've been studying the geological and climatological data from Earth that you provided. Your planet didn't just have variable conditions. It had actively hostile conditions that changed rapidly and unpredictably across multiple environmental parameters simultaneously. Yeah, that sounds like Earth. Most death worlds have one or two major hazards that drive evolutionary adaptation. High radiation, extreme temperatures, toxic atmospheres, dangerous predators. Earth had all of those hazards, plus natural disasters, climate instability, geological activity, and environmental changes that occurred faster than most species could adapt to. Right, so we had to adapt to adapting, if that makes sense. It does make sense. It also explains why humans are so effective at disaster response. You're not just adapted to survive in hostile environments, you're adapted to rapidly assess and respond to changing hostile environments. Captain Vasquez was quiet for a moment, processing this information. So what you're telling me is that humans are basically the galactic equivalent of emergency response equipment. In a manner of speaking, yes. And the reason we're so good at disaster response is that we evolved on a planet that was basically a never-ending disaster. That is a remarkably accurate summary, yes. Captain Vasquez started laughing again, the same kind of laughter from when she'd first been asked about human armor technology. You know what the funny part is? She said. We never thought of ourselves as special. We just thought everyone else was delicate. You're not special in the sense of being superior, clarified Counselor Thijs Cavell. You're special in the sense of being adapted to a completely different set of evolutionary pressures than any other known species. Right. We're weird, not better. Weird in a way that makes you exceptionally useful for certain applications. Captain Vasquez nodded. I can live with that. So what happens now? Now, said Counselor Zeftan, we formalize the Human Disaster Response Corps as a permanent galactic hegemony service, expand the training programs, and start developing specialized equipment designed to enhance human capabilities rather than replace them. Enhance how? Better communications equipment, more efficient tools, improved sensors. Technology that works with human adaptability rather than trying to protect you from everything. That actually makes a lot of sense. And so the Human Disaster Response Corps became a permanent fixture of galactic civilization. Human teams were stationed throughout the hegemony, ready to respond to emergencies that were too dangerous, too complex, or too unpredictable for standard protocols. They developed a reputation for showing up to impossible situations, assessing them with the casual indifference of people checking the weather, and then proceeding to solve problems that had stumped entire teams of engineers and emergency specialists. More importantly, they brought a completely different philosophy to emergency response. Instead of avoiding dangerous situations, they approached dangerous situations as puzzles to be solved. Instead of waiting for ideal conditions, they worked with whatever conditions they had. Instead of following protocols, they adapted protocols to fit the situation. It was, the galactic community eventually realized, a very human approach to problems. Practical, flexible, and utterly unconcerned with the fact that something was supposed to be impossible. The final validation of this approach came about 2 years later, during what historians would later call the Sigma Draconis incident. A deep space research facility studying dark matter interactions had suffered what could charitably be described as a catastrophic multi-system failure, and what the insurance companies would later describe as an act of physics we're not legally required to cover. The facility's experimental dark matter containment field had destabilized, creating a pocket of space-time where the normal rules of physics were more like loose suggestions. Inside the affected area, gravity fluctuated randomly, time moved at inconsistent rates, electromagnetic fields behaved like abstract art, and matter occasionally forgot what state it was supposed to be in. The automated systems had given up and started displaying error messages in languages that didn't exist yet. The facility's crew, a mix of Corvinathi researchers, Vaxi technicians, and Relthan engineers, had managed to evacuate to a safe distance, but they couldn't actually leave the system because the space-time distortions were preventing their ships from engaging faster than light drives. They were stuck watching their multi-billion credit research station slowly dissolve into what could best be described as a physics violation in progress. Standard emergency protocols for this situation didn't exist, mostly because no one had imagined it was possible to accidentally break space-time in quite this specific way. The Galactic Emergency Response Authority's official recommendation was to establish a quarantine perimeter and wait for the distortion to either stabilize or collapse naturally, which would take anywhere from 6 months to 6,000 years. That's when someone suggested calling in the Human Disaster Response Corps. "Absolutely not," said Emergency Coordinator Vex Ton Prime over the emergency communication channel. "The area is experiencing temporal distortions, gravitational anomalies, and reality fluctuations. It's completely inaccessible to any known form of life." "Have you asked the humans if it's inaccessible?" replied Captain Vasquez from the HDRC command ship that had just arrived in system. "Captain, with all due respect, this isn't like the previous emergencies your teams have handled. This is a fundamental breakdown of physical laws within a localized area of space-time." "Right, so it's Tuesday." There was a pause while Coordinator Vex Ton Prime tried to parse that response. "I'm sorry, what?" "Look," said Captain Vasquez, "I've got a team here that includes Engineer David Park. You remember him from the Infinite Wisdom incident. Plus Specialist Martinez, who once manually repaired a warp core while it was mid-jump. And Technician Wong, who has a degree in theoretical physics and a hobby of collecting dangerous things that probably shouldn't exist. Captain, the readings we're getting from that facility indicate that the normal laws of physics are optional in that area." "Good. Maybe that means the normal laws of humans can't survive this are optional too." What followed was the most thoroughly documented example of humans doing something that was, by every reasonable scientific standard, impossible. The plan, such as it was, involved sending a small human team in a heavily modified shuttle to approach the research facility and attempt to manually stabilize the dark matter containment system. The modifications to the shuttle included additional shielding, backup life support systems, and what the humans cheerfully referred to as a really good prayer. The approach itself went about as well as could be expected, which is to say that the shuttle's instruments immediately began displaying readings that violated several fundamental constants, and the artificial gravity started fluctuating between 0.3 and 2.7 standard units in random patterns. "How are you doing in there?" asked Coordinator Vex Ton Prime over the comm. "Well," replied David Park, "the good news is that we're still alive. The bad news is that I'm pretty sure we just flew through a section of space where time was moving backwards and now our nav computer thinks we haven't been born yet." "That's impossible." "Yeah, I get that a lot. Martinez, can you check those gravitational readings?" "Gravity is currently doing something that my instruments are describing as interpretive dance," replied Specialist Martinez. "Also, I'm pretty sure that panel over there is phasing in and out of existence." "That's probably fine. Wong, what's our status on the dark matter containment approach?" "Well," said Technician Wong, "according to my calculations, the dark matter field is fluctuating in a pattern that should be creating closed time-like curves, which means we might be approaching the facility before we left to approach the facility." "Does that affect our mission?" "Not really. It just means the effect-cause relationship is more of a guideline than a rule right now." "Cool. Coordinator, we're proceeding with the approach." From the external monitoring ships, the rescue mission looked like watching someone try to land a spacecraft inside a kaleidoscope that was having an argument with a physics textbook. The shuttle would appear to be moving forward, then suddenly be in a completely different location, then briefly exist in two places at once, then stretch out like taffy before snapping back to normal proportions. "This is insane," muttered one of the Corvenathi observers. "No," corrected Captain Vasquez. "This is Tuesday. Insane was last week when Martinez had to manually restart a black hole." The humans reached the research facility after what their instruments recorded as either 45 minutes or -3 hours, depending on which temporal reference frame you used. The facility itself was in even worse condition than the external scans had suggested, with entire sections existing in different time streams, and the main reactor core apparently having achieved some kind of quantum superposition between working normally and violating the laws of thermodynamics. "Okay," said David Park as they docked with the station. "This is definitely weird, even by our standards." "Define weird," said Martinez. "I just checked the atmospheric readings for the station. According to the sensors, the air inside is simultaneously breathable, toxic, non-existent, and composed entirely of strawberry-flavored quarks." "Strawberry-flavored quarks?" "That's what the computer says. I'm choosing to interpret that as probably safe to breathe, but maybe don't lick anything." "Reasonable approach," agreed Wong.
I'm reading some interesting energy patterns from the dark matter containment system. It looks like the containment field is trying to contain dark matter that's phasing between dimensions, which is causing reality to get confused. Confused how? Well, the dark matter is apparently arguing with the containment field about which dimension it wants to exist in, and the containment field is responding by trying to exist in all dimensions simultaneously, which is causing local space-time to have what I can only describe as an identity crisis. Can we fix it? Probably. I'll need to manually recalibrate the containment field generators while standing inside the field itself. The field that's currently causing space-time to have an identity crisis? Yeah, that one. Will that kill you? Unknown. I might temporarily stop existing, or I might exist too much, or I might experience time in the wrong order. But probably not permanent death. Good enough. Let's do it. What happened next was recorded by multiple instruments from multiple observation points, and the recordings still don't make complete sense. According to the data, Technician Wong entered the dark matter containment area, where he simultaneously existed, didn't exist, existed in the past, existed in the future, and briefly existed as a theoretical concept rather than a physical person. While in this state, he apparently recalibrated the containment field generators by adjusting settings that, according to the engineering logs, couldn't be adjusted by anyone who was experiencing linear time. The process took either 6 hours or -12 minutes, depending on whose chronometer you trusted, and resulted in Wong emerging from the containment area with a mild headache and what he described as a really interesting perspective on the relationship between consciousness and space-time. The dark matter containment field stabilized, the reality distortions collapsed, and the research facility returned to normal space-time with nothing more than some confused automated systems and a few research notes that had been written before the experiments that inspired them. "How?" asked Coordinator Vexton Prime when the humans returned to the command ship. "Did you survive exposure to non-linear time and unstable reality?" "Honestly," replied Wong, "I'm not entirely sure we did. I mean, we're here now, but I have memories of not being here, and also memories of being here before we got here. It's possible we're actually quantum echoes of ourselves, and the real versions are still in there trying to figure out how to recalibrate a containment field that exists in 17 dimensions simultaneously. That's concerning." "Yeah, a little. But the mission got completed, so I'm calling it a win." The Sigma Draconis incident became legendary throughout the galaxy, not just because of the successful resolution, but because of the casual, matter-of-fact way the humans had approached a situation that had broken several fundamental laws of physics. The incident report, filed by David Park, contained what became the most quoted line in galactic emergency response literature. "Mission completed successfully. Temporal distortions and reality fluctuations were manageable once we stopped expecting them to make sense. Recommend adding nonlinear time exposure to standard HDRC training curriculum. Also recommend increasing hazard pay rates for missions involving existential uncertainty." In the years that followed, the Human Disaster Response Corps evolved from an emergency service into something approaching a galactic institution. Human teams were deployed not just for equipment failures and environmental hazards, but for any situation where conventional approaches had failed, and someone needed to think outside the normal parameters of physics, logic, or common sense. They developed specialized equipment designed to work with human adaptability rather than replace it, tools that could function across wide environmental ranges, communication systems that worked even when local physics were unreliable, and sensors that could provide useful data even when reality was being uncooperative. More importantly, they developed a training philosophy based on the fundamental human principle that impossible was usually just another word for hasn't been figured out yet. New recruits learned not just emergency response procedures, but improvisational problem solving, environmental adaptation, and what the training manual carefully described as applied stubbornness in hostile conditions. They practiced working in simulated environments that violated various physical laws, because experience had shown that the universe had a disturbing tendency to break its own rules during emergencies. The program attracted humans from every background. Engineers who were bored with conventional problems, scientists who wanted to study impossible situations firsthand, and what one recruitment poster cheerfully described as people who think certain death sounds like an interesting challenge. But perhaps the most significant development was how the HDRC changed the way other species approached problems. "I've been thinking," announced Counselor Thais Cavell at a routine Galactic Council meeting. "About what?" asked Captain Vasquez. "About human problem-solving methodologies. Specifically, the way humans approach impossible situations." You mean the way we ignore the fact that they're impossible and try to solve them anyway? Exactly. We've been observing human emergency response teams for 3 years now, and we've noticed that humans consistently succeed in situations where our conventional approaches fail. Right. Because we're too stubborn to know when something can't be done. I don't think it's stubbornness, said Counselor Thijs Cavell. I think it's a fundamentally different relationship with uncertainty and failure. Captain Vasquez raised an eyebrow. How so? When other species encounter a situation that exceeds our known parameters, our response is to retreat, reassess, and develop new tools or technologies to handle the situation safely. That sounds reasonable? It is reasonable. It's also slow, expensive, and doesn't work when the situation is changing faster than we can develop solutions. Whereas humans encounter a situation that exceeds known parameters, and their response is to shrug and start experimenting. Captain Vasquez grinned. Well, when you put it like that, it does sound kind of reckless. Reckless, yes, but also adaptive. Humans treat impossible situations as puzzles to be solved rather than barriers to be overcome. I guess that's true. We do tend to assume there's always a solution, even if we don't know what it is yet. And that assumption leads to behaviors that other species find instructive. Instructive how? Counselor Thijs Cavell activated a holographic display showing statistics from various emergency responses over the past 3 years. We've been analyzing the problem-solving approaches used by human teams versus conventional emergency response protocols. Human teams consistently identify solutions that our standard protocols miss, not because they have superior technology or training, but because they approach problems from completely different assumptions. What kind of assumptions? Human teams assume that there is always a solution, that it's better to try something than to wait for perfect information, that failure is a source of data rather than a reason to stop, and that impossible is a starting point for creative thinking rather than an endpoint. Captain Vasquez was quiet for a moment. You know, when you list it out like that, it does sound like a pretty different way of thinking. It's not just different, it's effective. We've started incorporating human problem-solving methodologies into our own emergency response training, and the results have been remarkable. Really? Corvinathi emergency teams have started using what they call human-style improvisation, attempting solutions based on incomplete information and adapting in real time based on results. Vaxi engineers have begun practicing human-style persistence, continuing to work on problems even after conventional approaches have failed. Relthan technicians have started using human-style experimentation, testing multiple approaches simultaneously, rather than following linear troubleshooting protocols. And it's working? Emergency response times have improved by an average of 40%. Solution success rates have increased by 60%. And perhaps most significantly, teams are successfully resolving situations that would previously have been classified as unsolvable. Captain Vasquez sat back in her chair. So you're saying that humans aren't just good at surviving impossible situations? We're good at teaching other people how to survive impossible situations? More than that. You're good at teaching other people how to think about impossible situations in ways that make them possible. Huh. I never thought about it that way. The Human Disaster Response Corps has become more than an emergency service. It's become a source of new approaches to problem-solving that are spreading throughout galactic civilization. That's actually pretty cool. It's revolutionary, corrected Counselor Thijs Cavell. For the first time in galactic history, we have a systematic approach to handling situations that exceed our known capabilities. And it's based entirely on human assumptions about the nature of problems and solutions. Captain Vasquez grinned. You know what the funny part is? Those aren't even uniquely human assumptions. We just never learned to think any other way because our planet never gave us the option of giving up. Perhaps that's the most important lesson, said Counselor Thijs Cavell, that the difference between possible and impossible is often just a matter of perspective. The conversation was interrupted by an emergency alert from the Galactic Emergency Response Authority. Another impossible situation had developed somewhere in the Outer Rim, and someone needed to figure out how to solve a problem that shouldn't have been solvable. Captain Vasquez stood up and rolled up her sleeves. Well, she said, looks like it's time to go prove that impossible is just another word for Tuesday. And that's how humanity accidentally became the galaxy's emergency response specialists, philosophical advisors, and general-purpose problem solvers. Not because we were better than anyone else, but because we were too stubborn to accept that some problems couldn't be solved, and too adaptable to be stopped by the fact that we didn't know how to solve them. It wasn't the most elegant solution to interstellar cooperation, but it worked.
And in the end, that's a very human approach to take. If it works, it's not stupid. Even if it probably should be.